At the beginning of the previous chapter, I showed you how to define a site in Dreamweaver, and I discussed the importance of doing so, and we also looked at some examples of file management in Dreamweaver. In that example, we used a pre-existing site. We were working with files that had already been partially completed. In this chapter of movies, I want to cover the basic fundamental things you need to know in order to get started with working on your own sites. So, to start out in this movie, I'm going to walk you through the process of defining a site again, but this time we're going to do so as if we're starting a brand new site from scratch. So I have no pages or other files created yet. And I've already gone to my window menu here and gone to workspace layout, and I chose the designer layout for all of my panels and workspace. If you're on the Mac, you could just choose default, just so we tidy things up a little bit for this chapter. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is to create a new folder to hold all of my website-related files. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to put mine on the desktop, but you might want to create your own folders elsewhere on your computer. Personally, on my own computer at home, I have one folder called Websites, and in there I store all of the various websites that I work on. So all of the root folders for all of the websites I work on go in one folder called Websites. All right, so out here on my desktop, first of all, I don't need this site control folder anymore that I used in the previous chapter, so I'll just send that to the recycle bin. And what I'm going to do on my desktop is just right-click and create a new folder. And this process is the same on the Mac, except you control-click if you don't have a 2-button mouse. And now I have an untitled new folder. Now, I'm just going to show you how I personally like to set up my local root folder for a new site. It's perfectly okay just to use this one folder that we already created as your local root folder, but I like to stay a little bit more organized. So I'm going to start by naming this folder Basics, since we're working in the chapter on Basics right now. Now I'll open this folder up. You can see it's an empty folder. Now, for lack of a better word, I'm going to call this my master folder. Inside this master folder, I'm going to create another empty folder. Again, right-clicking, folder. And this is going to serve as the actual local root folder for this site. This is actually going to be the site folder. I'm going to call this one tcloud Basics. Now, even though we're working on a tcloud site again, this has nothing to do with the site that we were working on in the previous chapter. We're starting fresh here, and we're just building our site from scratch. So I'm just calling it tcloud because it's going to be based off that tcloud site again, and Basics because we're working in the Document Basics chapter. Again, if you were working on your own site, you would just name this something to do with whatever site you're working on. So this is the folder that I'm going to define in Dreamweaver as my site. Now, the reason I put it in a master folder is because I like to keep absolutely everything that has to do with my website in one main folder. This includes all of my unoptimized images and text files containing content that I'm going to use in my site. And it also might contain any notes and other snippets that I might need. But I don't want all these things in my actual root folder because only things that I intend to upload to my web server should go in there. When I eventually publish my website, I don't need to send my notes, raw text files, or large images. But I still want to keep all of these things in the same place. So what I'll do is create a few more folders in here. I'm going to create another one. I'm just going to call this one Raw Images. And another one. Call this one Text Files. And I'll create one more. And I'll call it Media Files. Doesn't matter that I have spaces in these file names because these folders aren't going to be used on my website. They're just going to hold the raw materials I'll be building my site with. Again, this is just how I personally like to do things. If you prefer to keep all of your related files elsewhere on your computer, that's fine as well, just as long as you remember where you keep everything. The only thing I suggest is that you do keep them outside of your local root folder. So the stage is set. I have a bunch of empty folders all labeled the way I need them to be labeled. Now I just need to point Dreamweaver to the right place. So in Dreamweaver, I'm going to come up to the Site menu and choose Manage Sites. Now I could have just as easily clicked New Sites from that menu or clicked the Dreamweaver Site button in the Start page here, like I did in the previous chapter. But I want you to see that there are several ways to define a site. Then you can decide for yourself which method works best for you. When you choose Manage Sites, you get this window that lists all the sites you've ever defined in Dreamweaver. From here, you can edit an existing site. You can see the previous site that I was working with, tcloud04. You can also choose to delete it from the list if you no longer need to work with that particular site. Or you can create a brand new site definition. Oh, and I should point out that when you remove a site from this list, you're not actually deleting the site itself. You're just getting rid of its definition here in Dreamweaver. All the files and folders in that site, wherever they happen to be on your hard drive, remain exactly where they are. And you can always redefine the site later again if you decide you need to work on it again. Okay, but I want to define a new site, so I'm going to click New and select Site from this menu that appears. And now I see the same window that I did the last time I defined a site. Now, since I walked you through this not-so-advanced section last time, I'll show you how to use the Basics section this time to define a site. So basically, this is a simple setup wizard that asks you some questions and gets the same information from you that you would manually enter under the Advanced tab. It's just going to walk you through this with a little bit more explanation of what it needs. So the first question here is, what do I want to name my site? This is referring to the site name that we saw in the Advanced section right up here. And again, this name has nothing to do with the site, and it won't be used online. The only thing it really has to do with the site is it's just sort of a nickname that you're going to give this particular collection of files here in Dreamweaver. For this exercise, I'm just going to call this one tcloud basics, just like I called the local root folder tcloud basics. In the real world, you might be building a site about your vacation to the Grand Canyon, so you might name this Vacation or Grand Canyon or something like that. Next, it's asking for the web address of my site. I don't have my site online right now, so I'm just going to ignore this and click Next. Now it's asking me if I want to use any special server technology. This is really important when you start making websites that connect to databases and contain dynamic content, but we're not going to be covering any of that stuff in these movies. That's a whole other tutorial. So I'm going to choose no, I don't want to use any server technology. You can't make me do it. And I'll click Next. Here you're asked how you want to work with your files as you're building your site. You have the choice of working on your computer, which is the recommended method, or you can work directly with the files that are actually out there on the web. The live files that everyone who knows about your site can presumably get to while you're actually working on them. Why you'd want to do that, I don't know. It definitely makes much more sense to work on your own computer locally, test and check everything, and then upload the files. So we're going to leave Edit Local Copies on my machine selected. Now I have to specify where on my hard drive my local files are located. This is just like setting up the local root folder under the Advanced tab. So this is why we took the time at the beginning to create those empty labeled folders. And if you look in here, it actually has sort of guessed which folder I want to use because I entered that name a couple screens back. It's on my desktop, tcloud basics. But if for some reason the folder you didn't want to use was not listed in here, just click the browse icon, find your folder. Let me actually go in here. If you're on the Mac, you would just select the file that you want to use and click Choose. If you're on the Windows like we are, you would open up tcloud basics or whatever the folder happens to be, and then you would click Select. And that's the actual folder. Previously, it just selected Basics, but I wanted to specify that I wanted the actual tcloud basics folder inside of there. Okay, so now I've named my site and I've pointed Dreamweaver to the site folder. Next, it's going to ask me how am I going to connect to my remote server to upload files. We're not going to worry about this section right now. I'm going to talk more about this when we get to the chapter on uploading your files. For now, I'm just going to choose None. I can always come back and change that later. And I'll go and click Next. So now we see a summary of all of our choices. If I see any mistakes, I can click the back button to go back and fix them. If I click over to the Advanced tab for a moment, you can see that Dreamweaver has filled in all this information here under the Local Info section. Let me go back again. Okay, there we go. I'll click Done. Oops, wait a second. Local root folder got changed too. So I don't recommend that you switch back and forth between the Basic and Advanced tab while you're working on defining your site, or else you can run into problems like this. There we go. Okay, now everything's right. Now I'll click Done. All right, since we started by choosing Site Manage Sites, I still see the Manage Sites window here. All I have to do is make sure the site that I want to work on is selected, and I'll click Done. Dreamweaver just takes a minute to create some cache info. And now I'm ready to start building my pages. Over here in the Files panel, you can see that the root folder is listed at the very top here, but the panel itself is empty because the folder itself is empty. We're going to start adding content in the following movies. But at this point, you should be fairly comfortable with defining sites. Again, defining a site is probably the most important step in getting started with your website. So if you're not quite clear on it yet, go back and watch this movie again, as well as the first movie in the previous chapter. Now that we have our blank site created, let's take a look at how to do one of the most basic and common tasks in Dreamweaver, creating a new blank page. What you're going to find in Dreamweaver, if you haven't figured it out already, is that there are lots of different ways to accomplish many tasks in this application. For instance, I mentioned earlier that you can find almost all the objects in the insert bar under the insert menu as well. And you've already seen that there are at least a couple of different ways to define a site in Dreamweaver. And off the top of my head, I can think of at least 3 or 4 ways to create a new blank page. But do you have to know all of these different methods for accomplishing the same task in order to use Dreamweaver to your advantage? Absolutely not. Throughout these movies, I'm going to be showing you lots of different ways to do things, but I strongly encourage you to try them and figure out which methods work best for you and the way you like to work. If you're into keyboard commands, for example, you might want to memorize the ones you use most often. But if you prefer to use the mouse, you don't need to clutter your brain with keyboard commands and instead just click around the interface to do your work. So in this movie, I'd like to show you some of the ways to create a new blank page in Dreamweaver 8. At this point, I've already created my new blank site, and I can see my empty site folder sitting here in the Files panel. So let me start by showing you my preferred method for creating a new page. I'm just going to come in here to the Files panel and right-click or control-click on the Mac on the main site folder here and choose New File. Dreamweaver generates a new blank page for me, and it's got its name highlighted and prompts me to name it. So let's say I'm creating the home page of my site first, so I'm going to call this one index.html. And there's my page. If I want to start working on it, I just double-click on it, and off I go. Now, the main advantage to this method of creating a new page, and the reason that I prefer it over the others, is that it saves me a couple of steps. By right-clicking in the Files panel and creating my page is automatically saved in my local root folder, which again is where I want to save all the pages that have to do with my site. I don't have to worry about opening a new page and coming up to File, Save, naming my file, and then navigating to the local root folder. If I make any changes to this page, like if I give this page a title of Welcome to tcloud.com, I can just choose File, Save to save those changes without having to choose a save location because it's already been saved in my root folder. My file is saved exactly where I want it. And again, this is the fastest way to create a new page. So there's my index page. Now, what's another way to create a page? Well, since I have my start page open, I can come in here under the Create New column and choose from several styles of pages. Right now, I'm only concerned with creating basic XHTML pages, so I'll click HTML to generate a new page. Now, I do realize that I just said I wanted to create an XHTML compliant page, but I clicked HTML. I'll talk about this in the very next movie. For now, just notice that Dreamweaver has opened a brand new blank page for me. And notice up here at the top it says Untitled 5. Now, it sure looked like this was the faster way to create a blank page. All I had to do was click the HTML button and up popped the page. But the issue here is that, unlike the first page I created, this page is not yet saved. Whenever you create a new page using this method, you should always first save it. That way Dreamweaver will know exactly where the page resides in your site, and it will be able to properly write the code for pages and images linked to from this page. So I'm going to choose File, Save. You can also hit Control-S or Command-S on the Mac. Now I want to make sure that I'm saving this file into my local root folder, which I happen to be in right now. Dreamweaver should, and I stress should, automatically display your local root folder here, but you want to be sure to check and make sure that that is in fact where you are. Remember, every page in your site needs to be in your local root folder someplace. Doesn't matter if they're in subfolders or within folders that are in other folders, as long as that they are technically within your main local root folder, it's fine. I am in that folder right now, and now I need to name this file. You don't want a file that's called untitled anything. So let's say this is the page that's going to be describing the methods for brewing tea. So I'm just going to call this one brewing.html. And I'll click Save. And you notice it has been updated here in my site window. And since you should always give your page a title, I'll title this one tcloud.com:brewing. I always like to put the name of the site in the page title, just in case my viewers bookmark the page, they'll know which site the bookmark refers to. But it's one of those choices that's up to you. You can title the page anything you want, but again, I do recommend that you give it a good descriptive title. So I'll go ahead and save that with Control-S or Command-S if you're on the Mac. And I'll close that for the moment. So there's my second page. So we've seen two methods so far of creating a new blank page. If you've chosen not to have the start page display in Dreamweaver, or if you just want some more options for creating a page, another method is to choose File, New, or to hit Control-N or Command-N. This window here gives you tons of options to create all sorts of different pages and to choose from several different types of templates. You can see you can choose from these different categories like basic pages, dynamic, templates, and so on. Again, I'm just going to be working with a basic HTML page here, so I'll just choose Basic Page, HTML, and click Create. And again, it opens up a blank document for me, just like the start page did. So again, I should save this right away. Now, one thing you might want to occasionally do when you save your pages is to save them in a subfolder within your main local root folder. And again, as long as everything is in your main folder, you can have as many subfolders as you like. You don't need to use subfolders if you don't want to. Dreamweaver will still be able to keep track of things even if you throw all of your images, pages, style sheets, or whatever into just one main root folder. The question is whether you'll be able to keep track of things like that. So I recommend that you organize yourself by placing certain pages and images into their own folders when it makes sense to you to do so. For example, let's say this page I just created is going to be the main page that tells the history of tea. I'm going to have other pages about tea as well, so it makes sense for me to create an About Tea folder. So I'll click this New Folder button here to create a new directory in my local root folder. If you're on a Mac, you have a nice obvious New Folder button in the lower left-hand corner of this dialog box to click. If you're using Windows, this is your New Folder button right here. So I'm going to name this folder About_Tea. And I'm using the underscore again because I am working in my local root folder and I don't want to use spaces. And since the page I'm saving is going to be the main page in this About Tea folder, I'm going to go into that folder and I'm going to call this one index.html because, again, this is going to be the default page for this folder. Click on Save. And okay, there it is. And of course, I'll give this page a title, tcloud.com: the history of tea. And there it is, and I'll close and save that page. So notice over here in the Files panel, it just continues to update itself every time I create a new file or folder. There's the folder and the file that I just created. If I look on my desktop, I can see all the files and folders that were generated. If I look in Basics, and in my tcloud Basics site folder, there's the index page I created, there's Brewing, here's the About Tea folder, and there's the index page in there. So there you have a couple of different methods for creating new pages as well as folders. Again, I prefer to do all of that from the Files panel because it just cuts out the step of having to navigate through your site folder. Let me just do a few more quick examples to illustrate how easy it is to use the Files panel. I might want to create another page to go inside the About Tea folder. So I'll just right-click that particular folder and choose New File. The new untitled page appears inside the folder because that's the one I right-clicked, and I'll name this one fields.html since it's going to be about tea fields. Now, if I want to create a new subfolder in my main local root folder, I just right-click on the main local root folder and choose New Folder. And again, the folder appears in the folder that I clicked on. And I'll call this one About Us. And again, if I want to add some pages to this folder, I can just right-click on them, New File, create the index page for this folder. And I'll add one more. Call this one Locations.html. See how I never had to leave the Files panel to do this? Didn't have to use a start page, didn't have to choose File New. Everything is named and saved in the right place. Now I should just go through and give each one of these pages a title, but that's a simple matter of just opening the page, coming up here and going tcloud.com, locations, like so. But I'm going to leave some of these pages untitled for now because I want to show you how to find untitled pages a little later on. But for now, that's how you go about creating new pages in Dreamweaver 8. So pick the method that works best for you. You might want to play around with the different methods for a little bit, but eventually you'll settle on the one that works best for you. In the previous movie, I showed you a couple of ways to create a new blank page in Dreamweaver. Each of the pages I created were just basic HTML pages. Now, if you recall, at the beginning of this tutorial, way back in the chapter on background information, I mentioned that Dreamweaver writes all of its code to be XHTML compliant, XHTML being the new standard for web page code. In this movie, I just want to quickly show you where in Dreamweaver to find the preferences to determine how strictly your pages conform to that XHTML standard. Let's start by choosing File, New, just like we did in the previous movie to create a new page. And in that movie, I showed you that to create a basic HTML page, you can click Basic Page and HTML. Now, with HTML selected, down here we have this document type field. And in parentheses, we see DTD. And that stands for Document Type Declaration. The default setting in this field is XHTML 1.0 Transitional. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, let's take a look. I'm going to go ahead and click Create, just like I did before. And now I'm looking at a blank page. Now, switching to Code View, check out the very first line of the HTML code. In fact, I'm going to turn off word wrap so you can just see that entire line, or most of the entire line there. This line of code is known as the Document Type Declaration, or as I already said, DTD. And it's used for two primary purposes. First, when you use certain HTML validators, these are programs that check the compliance of your HTML code, this first line in the page tells the validator which version of HTML, or in this case XHTML, this page is supposed to comply with. So a validator would look at this line and see that this page should comply with XHTML 1.0 transitional standards. And secondly, the document type declaration tells the viewer's web browser how to display the page in standards compliant mode. Now, all web pages should have a DTD. They'll work without one in most cases, but without a DTD, modern browsers won't render your page in a standards compliant mode, and if you're using things like cascading style sheets, your page might not display properly. Because of this one line of code here, your viewers' web browsers will know how to properly display your page, which gives you a much better chance that things will appear as you intend them to appear. Notice that within this entire line, there is an actual full web address in here. http, www.w3.org, and this address. This is a path to the actual document on the W3C's website. Again, the W3C is a standards committee that comes up with all these different web standards. It's a link to their website to a document containing the information that tells the browser how to render this site compliant to, in this case, the XHTML 1.0 transitional standard. So when the browser first opens this document, it sees this address, and it actually goes there and figures out how to render this page. So I'm going to go ahead and close this page for the moment. Now I'm going to choose File New again. Now down here in the DTD menu are the other standards you can have your page comply with. XHTML is the best standard for right now because it sort of acts as the bridging standard between the old HTML 4.01 ways and the much stricter pure XHTML standard. In a few years from now, you might see a movement to have pages conform to XHTML 1.1 or an even newer version. For the most part, I would say to leave the setting at XHTML 1.0 transitional. But if for some reason you need your page to comply to one of the other standards, it's a simple matter to just select it from this menu on a per-page basis. So if I wanted a single page to be HTML 4.01 transitional, I could click on that, hit Create, and I can see right here it's now set to that particular standard. Let me switch that back to XHTML before I forget. Now, if for some reason you need to create a whole site full of pages that comply to, say, that HTML 4.0 transitional standard, you're not going to want to have to select this from the menu every single time you create a new page. Or maybe you want to use that right-click method that I showed you in the previous movie for creating new HTML pages by selecting New File. And this particular method gives you no way of choosing a different DTD. So under Dreamweaver's preferences, I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences. If you're on a Mac, it'll be Dreamweaver Preferences. In the Preferences window, I'm going to go to the New Document category. So here you can choose the default document declaration for all new documents. And you can see the default setting is XHTML 1.0 transitional. So if I wanted all of my documents from now on to be HTML 4.01 transitional, I could select that. So from this point on, all new documents will have that type of standard unless you switch the type by coming in here and choosing new. You see it's set to HTML. If I wanted to switch it just for this page that I'm about to create back to the XHTML standard, I could do that. But I'm going to go back and switch my default setting again because I want all my pages to be XHTML transitional. Oh, and incidentally, while I'm in here, this is the same preference area where you can decide whether your pages are going to have the extension of HTML or if you want it to be HTML, you can do that as well. But I'll leave mine as .html. So that's a little bit about the document type declaration. Really, it's not something you have to be too concerned with since Dreamweaver defaults to the XHTML transitional standard anyway. But should there come a time in the future when you need to change the DTD, at least you'll know where to go. But until then, just keep this information in the back of your head and go about creating your web pages as you normally would. In the movie immediately following the one that you're watching right this second, I'm going to be showing you several different methods for inserting images into your web pages. But before I do that, I want to introduce you to a very important panel in Dreamweaver called the Assets panel. You'll find it in the Files panel group here. The Assets panel you can sort of think of as a catalog of all the different images or colors or links, templates, library items, things that you might be using in Dreamweaver. And this is sort of your one-stop shop to find access to all of these different things that you might need to use as you continue to work on your website. Here in the Assets panel, you notice that it's broken down into several different categories. At the top, I have images, we have colors, links or URLs, Flash content, Shockwave, movies, scripts, templates, and libraries. Now, currently, a lot of these are empty. In fact, all of them are empty because I really haven't added much to my site at all. The thing about the Assets panel is that when you open Dreamweaver, it automatically scans throughout your entire site, throughout your entire defined site, and finds all the appropriate things to put into these different categories. So once you define a site, if you already have images in, say, an images folder, when you come over to the Assets panel and click on images, all of the images will be listed right here, and you can have immediate access to them. As you start to do things like add different colors to your site, you'll see all your colors listed. If you are working with any types of links, you'll see your links listed in here, and so on and so on. So again, this is sort of your one-stop shop for all of the different assets you might need. And the great thing is, you don't need to manually add anything to the Assets panel. Dreamweaver automatically performs a scan and finds all the appropriate content in your site and puts them into the right categories. Now, occasionally you might need to hit the refresh button here to make sure that it gives you the most current listing, but most of the time, once you open up Dreamweaver, you should be able to see all the content that you need to access in your site here. So let me show you. Let me minimize Dreamweaver for the moment. Onto my desktop, I've copied the 05_basics folder from the exercise files folder. So if you have access to that folder, you can do so and follow along with me. Inside this folder, we have a folder called Images, and that in turn contains several different images that I'm going to be bringing into my site. And I already previously showed you a couple of different methods for bringing in content like images into your site. I'm going to use the method I showed you where you just sort of access it from your desktop instead of going into Dreamweaver. So let me just move that over to the side, and I'm going to look in my basics folder. Here's my root folder. And I'm going to place the images folder right into my root folder right here. So all I'm going to do is just drag it over there. And again, if you want to make a copy instead of just moving it in there, you can hold down the Control key on Windows or the Option key on the Mac. Just put a copy there so my original images stay where they are. Not really a need to do that every single time, but I usually like to just so I have a copy of the unchanged images in case I ever need to get back to them. Okay, so I've now added an images folder to my local root folder. If I go back to Dreamweaver, I don't see anything in the Assets panel yet. If I go over to Files, I do see that it has found that I've added the images folder here. So let me go over to Assets, and what I need to do now is hit the refresh button. Dreamweaver scans through the site and says, oh, there have been some images added, so now I see a listing of all the images that I just added. Pretty cool. With each of these images selected, you can see a preview of what that image looks like. This takes all the guesswork out of which image you're about to insert. Now you can insert images from the Files panel just by selecting, grabbing them, and then dragging them onto your page, but you kind of have to remember what these images are because you don't see any kind of preview, which is why I prefer to use the Assets panel because we can see the preview in here. And actually, if I group the assets as a new panel group, I can expand this so you can get a better look at exactly what kind of information is available in here. Not only do we see the name, but we can also see the pixel dimensions of the images, their file size, the type of file that they are, whether it's a GIF or a JPEG, and the full path to that image. You can see that all of these images are located in the Images folder, and here are all of their individual file names. Now, another thing you might want to do when you're working with your assets is take advantage of the Favorites capability in here. Notice when I click over there, all the images appear to disappear. But that's just because I haven't defined any favorites. And you want to use the Favorites section to store all of your most commonly used images. So for instance, if I have this header top image here, this is basically the main banner header for my entire website, and I'm probably going to use that on a lot of different pages. So instead of having to hunt through all of my images, and this list will get longer as you start to add more images to your site, and it will become a little bit harder to find the images that you want, instead of having to hunt through here, with that image selected, if I come down here to the lower right-hand corner, there's a button called Add to Favorites. So if I click on that, it says the selected assets have been added to this site's favorites list. To view it, go to your favorites list. Good enough. And again, that was down here in the lower right-hand corner. So now if I switch over to favorites, sure enough, it's listed right there. And it's much easier to find among what's bound to be a much shorter list here than it will be to find among the list of all of my images. So just be aware and remember that you have that favorites capability available to you right there. If you're tired of having something in the favorites, don't need it anymore, find that you're not using it as much as you thought you would, just select it, and notice now there's a little minus sign down here that allows you to remove it from the favorites. And all that really does is just take it out of that list. Notice that it's still available here in the main listing. I'm going to go ahead and redock this back with the rest of the files. There we go. So that's just a brief overview of the Assets panel. We're going to start using this more and more as we go along through all of these movies. But in the very next movie, I'm going to show you how to use the Assets panel to insert images into your web pages. In this movie, I'm going to show you several different methods for inserting images onto your web pages. Now, like many things in Dreamweaver, there are several different ways of performing this task. So I'm going to start off by showing you my preferred method for inserting images onto a web page, and then I'll show you a couple different other methods just in case you like those better. In the previous movie, we talked about the Assets panel and how it's sort of a catalog of all of your different files, images, colors, and things like that. With images selected, I can see all of the different images that are currently available in my defined website. Now let me go ahead and open up a file that I can add images to. So switching back to the Files panel, I'm going to come in here and open up index.html. Actually, I'm just going to collapse some of these folders so it's a little bit easier to look at. Open up index.html, which is currently just a blank page with the title up here at the top. And now I'll switch back to the Assets panel. And again, in the Assets panel, we see a listing of all our available images, and we can see a preview of them up here in the top pane as we click through them. So I'm going to add an image to this page using my Assets panel. Get ready to take notes. All I'm going to do is select this image, drag it onto my page. Now, in Dreamweaver 8, unless you've changed your settings already, you're going to see this Image Tag Accessibility Attributes window pop up. This is going to happen anytime you go to insert an image, because accessibility is a major concern when it comes to web design, for a lot of people anyway. Accessibility refers to making your pages as accessible as possible to people with vision disabilities, but also to people who might be viewing on smaller browsers or different browsers, like they might be viewing your website on their phone's browser, on a PDA, or on just some different type of browser on their computer. What this particular dialog box refers to is alternate text. They're asking you to put a text description of the image that you're about to insert. That way, people with vision disabilities who use special programs called screen readers or audible readers that actually read the contents of a web page to them out loud will be able to know what this image is about. Because these programs have no problem reading text, but when they come across an image, if you have an alternate text there, the program has no way to describe what that particular image is. Now I'm going to get to this at the end of this movie, but for now, notice here there's a link to change your accessibility preferences. I'm going to go ahead and click that. That's going to take me to my preferences pane. And for now, I'm just going to uncheck the images so it won't ask me to enter that information each time. I'm going to click on OK and cancel this. Okay, so there's my image. Let me just delete that for a moment and show you that again. All I did to add that image, drag the image onto my page. And because I changed my preferences this time, it didn't ask me to add any more information. And again, we'll get back to that accessibility issue in just a few moments. So that's really how easy it is to use the Assets panel to add an image to your page. With my cursor flashing to the right of it, I'm just going to press Enter or Return on my keyboard to go down to the next line. And I'll add a second image, and in this case, I want to grab frontimage.jpg, and I'm just going to drag that onto my page. And there it is. So you can see that if you know which images you want, you can make real quick work of this just by coming over to your Assets panel and starting to drag in images. Let me go down to the next line. Now let me show you a couple of other methods that don't use the Assets panel. First of all, you can use the Files panel. If I open up my Images folder and I find the image that I want to use next, aboutus.gif, I can drag that right in, like so. Now the disadvantage here is I don't see a preview of what that image looks like in the Files panel, so I kind of have to know the name of the file that I want when I do that. So I could just drag in images using that particular method. Another way is to use my insert bar. Under the common category here, if you look over here, we have a button called Images for inserting your images. So if I have images selected, and we have a couple of different types of images that we can insert here, I'm going to make sure I just have the most basic one selected there. Now what this does is it opens up a dialog box to allow me to hunt for the image that I want to use. So I'm going to make sure that I'm inside my root folder, which I am right now. Look inside the Images folder. And in here, I can get a preview of my different images. By clicking on them, I can see the image over here. If you don't see that, make sure you have Preview Images checked. Otherwise, you won't see your images previewed over on the right. So maybe I want this one, brewing.gif. You can see the file name down here. This is the URL. And right here it says relative to document or site root. I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit. But for now, this is the image that I want. And I'll click on OK. There it is. And I can just continue doing that. Now, the problem here for me is that this is a lot of clicking. To me is unnecessary because with my Assets panel, I can just drag images in. I don't have to worry about clicking Insert Image and then browsing for the file that I want. I'll select Drinking and click on OK. So for me, it's much easier just to go to the Assets panel, find the image that I want, and drag it in. Like so. So those are a couple of different methods for adding images to your web page. Now let's see what's going on in the code when we do this. Let me go ahead and select this first image I added and go over to Code View. The nice thing is when you select something in Design View and then switch to Code, whatever you have selected is then highlighted so you can easily find it. So you can see here the code that it's added is image source equals images/header-top.gif, which is the name of the file, and it automatically entered the width and height of that particular image. So you can start to appreciate all the code that Dreamweaver is writing for you in the background so you don't have to enter this information yourself. All you have to do is just drag the file in from your Assets panel. Now look at this information right here, the source information. This basically is the line of code that tells the browser where to find this image. It tells it to look in the Images folder and look for a file called header-top.gif. This is what's known as a relative path, meaning this path is relative to the page in which it appears. So this index.html page, if I switch back to my files, the index.html page appears in the main root folder. This being a relative path, it's saying, okay, in the main root folder, look for the folder called Images, and in there you'll find a file called header-top.gif. That's a relative path. The other type of path you can have is what's known as an absolute path. And that's something where you give the exact address of a file, regardless of its relation to the page that you're currently on. So if I was actually linking to a file that was actually on my website, for instance, this link might actually say http://tcloud.com/images/header-top.gif. That would be an example of an absolute path. And in most cases, it's not necessary to give an absolute path unless you're linking to a website other than your own. If you're linking to pages that are already within your site, Dreamweaver automatically creates a relative path. And that's what it was asking when I chose to insert an image before, whether I wanted to write the link as a relative link to the document or relative to the site root. And it says for site relative links, it only works if you enter a valid web address. So if this is back when we defined our site, it asked for an HTTP address, which we didn't enter in this case. So I'm just going to click OK and make sure that it's set back to document. Because again, in most cases, all of your paths are going to be relative to the page that they appear on. So let me go ahead and just cancel that. Okay, so now that I've added some images, let's talk a little bit about that accessibility issue. Again, accessibility means many different things, whether you're talking about somebody with vision disabilities or whether you're talking about making sure your page is accessible on like a mobile phone. But in the case that we saw when that dialog box popped up earlier, that had to do with adding alternate text, which is, again, the text that screen readers will be able to read when they come across images. Alternate text can also be useful for people who have set their browser preferences to not display images. Some people are still on dial-up connections. In fact, a lot of people are still on dial-up connections. So sometimes they'll surf with their images turned off, just so things go a little bit faster. I myself, when I spend a lot of time traveling, I have my browser on my laptop set up to display without images because a lot of time I'm dialing up through my cellular phone, and that's actually a little bit slower than standard dial-up. So when I'm surfing, I just want to get all the information and none of the images. So by providing alternate text, you can provide people who are surfing under these conditions text descriptions of what the images actually are. So with the image selected, if you come down to the Properties Inspector, you'll see an area called Alt for the alternate text. And in here, you just want to give a short description of what that image actually is. So I might type something like tcloud header. And I would just work my way through all of my images, selecting each one and adding some text. Splash image. And how detailed you get really depends on your own personal preference and how much information you want to give, just in case someone can't see your image. If you think splash image is enough to give somebody the gist of your image, that's fine. If you want to type, green rolling fields or under a cloud-covered sky with the T-Cloud logo on top of it, you can feel free to type that as well. What I especially recommend is that if you have images acting as buttons that are actually acting as navigation for your site, be specific. So type exactly what appears on the button. About us. About tea. Brewing. Drinking. Catalog. So now with that image selected, I'm going to click down here in the Alt field, and now I'll type Contact Us. Okay, so now I have all of my alt tags there. And really, you should just get into the habit of putting in an alt tag as soon as you insert an image. Unless it really, really bothers you, go back to your preferences under accessibility and check images again, so that when you do add an image to your page, it's going to prompt you for some alternate text, and you could type the alternate text in there. And you can see it's already been added there. Just delete that. So that's how you insert images onto your web page and some of the issues that you might want to consider, such as working with accessibility when you insert those images. Probably the most common type of content you'll be adding to your web pages is regular old text. And there's nothing really much to show you here. If you've ever used a word processor, and I hope you have, working with text in Dreamweaver is a lot like that. I'm just going to put my cursor to the right of the final image that I inserted in the last movie and press Enter or Return on my keyboard to go to the next line. So to add text, all we have to do is when we see a flashing cursor, we just type. So maybe I want to do a text version of the navigation that I created in the previous movie. So I'm going to type About Us, space, and I'm going to add what's called a pipe character by holding Shift and pressing the backslash button on my keyboard, which is where that pipe character is located. and then press space again. And I'm just going to continue through here, type about tea, space, pipe, space, brewing, drinking, catalog, contact us. And it's just like that. I have my text on my page. And again, it's very much like working with a word processor. But there are a couple differences about working with text that I'd like to mention now, and we're going to talk more about other issues when we get into the chapter on typography. One of the first things you might notice as you're working with text, if you're trying to do things like put space between words, is that you can't hit the space bar more than once. Actually, you can hit as many times as you like, you're just not going to have any effect. Notice that the cursor is not moving as I hit my space bar. The thing about working with HTML is that it only allows one space within a line of text. It only recognizes one space within a line of text. If you want to add space between words, there are a couple things you can do. You can insert what are called non-breaking spaces. You can insert a table, or you can use CSS to control the position of your text. But I just wanted you to be aware of that in case you ever go to try to add more spaces and nothing happens. Another issue that you need to know about is that when you press Enter after you've typed a line of text, the next line of text appears with sort of a gap between it and the previous line of text. And there really is no other line of text up there. Now, if I press my up arrow on my keyboard, notice that it jumps right up to that line. This is what's referred to as a paragraph break, and you get that every time you press the return key. So if I put my cursor there, press return, type more text, again I get a paragraph break. That's just the way things work when you're working with HTML. Now again, you can control this to some extent if you were working with, say, CSS. But another option that you have here is if, say, you were typing an address. 123 Fake Street. And you wanted to put the town on the very next line. Anytown, USA. That doesn't really look like an address because they're all in separate lines there. So instead of a paragraph break, what you need to add here is a line break. So I'm going to put my cursor at the beginning of the name of the city there and just press backspace or delete to go back to the previous line. To insert what's called a line break, I'm going to hold down Shift on my keyboard and then press Enter or Return. That gives me what's called a line break. That allows me to have two lines very tight together like that instead of having that gap between them. If I select this and switch over to the code view for a moment, you can see here's the opening paragraph tag that tells the browser that a new paragraph is beginning. You can see 123 Fake Street. Then there's a break tag that adds the line break, telling it to put the very next line of text on the very next line instead of having a space in between them. And here's the closing paragraph tag. So this address is actually considered one paragraph with a break within it. You can sort of see how that works. And while we're in here, this is something that I want to encourage you to do, is that as you continue to build your web pages, go into the code view every now and then to see the code that Dreamweaver writes to create what you see in the design view. This is a great way to start learning the basics of HTML so that if you ever have to come in here and start fixing things, you can sort of start following the patterns of how HTML works, and you can come in here and start fixing things on your own. So don't let this panic you. Just come in here and start looking around. You don't have to change anything, but if you do want to experiment, make sure you make a copy of your page first, and then you can come in here and start playing around with different tags. For instance, if I come in here and remove this line break tag, delete that, then go back to my design view, notice that everything ends up on the same line again. If I press Enter or Return without putting a line break in there, you can see that each line is its own separate paragraph. So let me add that line break back there. So this is just something you can sort of get in the habit of doing, going into your code and seeing how the code works every now and then, and just sort of start giving yourself an education on how HTML works. But those are just some of the basics that I wanted to give you on working with text. Again, we'll get more into the specifics of working with text in the chapter on typography. But right now, I just wanted to get some of the basics out of the way concerning how this is like working with a word processor in many cases, but it does have a couple quirks when it comes to being able to type only one space and it automatically adding almost a double space break when you press the Enter key. Now that we have some content on our page, we've got some text and we have some images, let's talk a little bit about basic alignment principles. When I talk about alignment, if you look at this page, you'll see that everything, the images and the text are all aligned to the left side of the page. And this is the default behavior anytime you add something to your page. Now, a little bit later, we'll get into more advanced topics like working with tables and maybe with style sheets to adjust the positioning of the objects on your page. But when you just add text or an image to your page with no tables or anything containing it, everything is going to automatically go to the left-hand side of the page. Now, we can do things like centering or moving things to the right as well. So, for instance, if I wanted to center this line of text here, all I need to do is put my cursor anywhere in that line of text. I don't have to highlight it, although highlighting it won't matter. It'll work the same way. As long as my cursor is somewhere in this line, when I come down to the Properties Inspector, you'll see that we have a series of alignment buttons here, and they look very much like the alignment buttons you'll find in your word processing programs. So if, let's say I wanted to center this, I could just click Align Center, and there it is. If I wanted to align it to the right, I could do that. And I could choose left, although that is the default setting. Although some people do like to choose left just because that actually puts the code in there. If I go and look at this in the code for a moment, that actually puts the code into the paragraph tag they're saying to align it to the left. If I click that Align Left button again, it still says Align to the left, but that just means it took away the code that said Align Left. Some people just like having the code in there just to be as specific as possible. So that really works for anything. As long as you're on the line, you can center it. I can go to this line with these images, center that. Same with this one, center that. And same with this one. Or if I wanted to, I could select everything on the page and I could just play with all the alignment at once. Now, the important thing to stress here is that, just like you saw, the alignment is set to the particular paragraph that you have your cursor in. Each separate line in Dreamweaver is considered a paragraph because, remember, if we look at the code, they're all separated with paragraph tags. So there's no way I can just select just this piece here and align that to the right. Everything on that line is going to be aligned. Even if I have something with a line break in it, like in the previous movie I had an address here, and if I pressed Shift-Enter to give myself a line break, I can type on the very next line. Now, if I have my cursor here and I hit, say, the left align button, notice that everything gets aligned to the left. That's because even though these are on separate lines, Dreamweaver still considers these to be the same paragraph. In fact, it's not Dreamweaver that's doing it, it's basic XHTML rules. As long as it's surrounded by a single paragraph tag, it's considered a single paragraph. The break tag does not separate the first line from the second line in terms of it being in different paragraphs. So if I did want to separate them onto separate lines, let me center that again, I would actually have to put a paragraph break between them. And now they're separate paragraphs, and I can send them to different sides of the page if I want to. So the important thing there is just to understand that these alignment buttons affect paragraphs at a time. And again, later when we get into tables, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about aligning objects on your page. Now, one other issue of alignment we should probably take a quick look at is the issue of aligning images with text. Because when you select an image, you notice we do have those regular alignment buttons here as well. But we also have this align menu. And notice it says default, but we have these weird choices like baseline, top, middle, bottom, text top, absolute middle, absolute bottom, left, and right. So let me tell you about this a little bit. Whoops. There we go. And just for this particular exercise, I'm going to switch back for a moment to the tcloud04 site that we defined earlier in the previous chapter, just because I want to grab some text, and we don't have any text in our current chapter. So let's see here. Let's go to About T, open up fields. All right, here's a good chunk of text in here. Let me just grab this text. I'm going to highlight it, choose Edit, Copy. Okay, I'm just going to close that, and we're back on this page here. So I'm just going to click next to my text navigation there and just go down to the next line, just to take off the alignment there, and choose to paste that in here. Okay, so now I have some text in here. Next, let's grab an image, and let's see. Actually, I'll just use this tcloud image. I'll just use a version of that. So let's go to Images. Whoops, got to switch back to my site. There we go. That's the front image, so I'm just going to insert that at the beginning of this paragraph here. I'll just say front splash image for my alternate text. Okay, so there it is. All right, now you notice With the image and the text being on the same line, the text by default lines up to the bottom of the image. That's the default alignment. Now, if I want to control how the text reacts to being on the same line as the image, that's what I do when I select the image and make selections from the Align menu down here. So let's take a look here. First of all, we have things like top, takes the text and puts the first line of the text as much as it will fit to the very top of the image, and then the rest of the text appears underneath the image there. Kind of a weird look. You would probably only choose top if you only had one line of text, otherwise you get this weird split in the paragraph like this. Same thing goes for middle. The difference is it just moves that line in alignment with the middle of the image. And we've got bottom, which is sort of the default appearance. Now we have things like text top, which looks very similar to top, but what it's doing is it's aligning the very top of the letters, like the very top of the T with the top of the image there. And top and text top are actually very similar. But if I go to, say, absolute middle, and then choose middle, you'll see a slight difference. Notice here that the baseline, the very bottom of the letters, is lined up to the middle of the image. If I choose absolute middle, the actual line that runs through the middle of the letters horizontally is what's lined up. Very slight difference, but that's what the difference is between those two. Same thing goes for absolute bottom and bottom. Absolute bottom takes the very lowest part of any letter in here. Like I don't have any letters with descenders in here, but if I just put, say, a letter G here, even though it's not a word, now I have a lower section of text here. So if I choose absolute bottom, notice how the text comes up a little bit so that the bottom part of the G, the descender, lines up at the bottom of the image. If I have just regular bottom selected, then the regular baseline of the text lines up at the bottom. It's a slight but definite distinction between those two. Now, if you're going to use any alignments at all, the most common ones you're probably going to use are left and right. If I choose left, notice that the text wraps around the image so that the image is aligned to the left of these paragraphs and they just sort of wrap around it. And the opposite is true with right. If I choose right, the image moves over to the right and the text wraps around that way. So this allows you to have a layout that will change based on the size of your window, but still, the text now wraps around the image. When I say it's going to wrap based on the size of a window, if I make this into a window for a moment, notice as I resize the window, the text rewraps, which may or may not be what you want it to do, but I'll show you how to control that with tables when we get to the section on tables. So that's just a little bit on the different types of alignment. Again, you have this whole menu available to you, and this really just refers to how the image is going to align itself to the text that it's on the same line with. And again, this is just a basic way of aligning your text and your images, but it does work for simple pages like this one. I'm just going to delete all that. Don't really need that anymore. Okay, so that's working with basic alignment principles in Dreamweaver. In this movie, I'm going to show you how to change the background colors of your page, as well as the color of text and some other properties of your page. Now, in order to do this, we need to look at our page properties. You'll find your page properties by going to the Modify menu and selecting Page Properties at the very top here. The keyboard command for this is Control-J. If you're on the Mac, it's Command-J. And it's one of those keyboard commands I suggest you learn because you'll probably find yourself coming in here pretty often, so you might just want to pop that one into your brain and remember it. Now, before we do anything in here, something important to note here. Starting in the previous version of Dreamweaver, which was Dreamweaver MX 2004, Dreamweaver started using cascading style sheets to define the properties of each page that you create. Now, depending on your needs, this may or may not be what you want it to do. And although I would agree that CSS is the way you should be doing things these days, if you want to do everything in a sort of modern, compliant way, you should be setting your page colors, your text colors, and everything with cascading style sheets. Now, the old way to do this was to use HTML or XHTML, and that's still acceptable in many situations, so I'm not going to bother using CSS until we actually get to the chapter on CSS. So for this one, if you notice when we're in page properties, we have several categories here, and then we can click on them to see different settings over here. Right now, with Dreamweaver set up by default to format my page's properties with CSS, this is the page properties window that I see. Let me cancel this for a moment. I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences. If you're on the Mac, you'll go to Dreamweaver Preferences. And under the General category, I'm going to uncheck Use CSS instead of HTML tags. So I'm going to do this the slightly older way. But for some people, this is actually an easier way to work because they haven't quite learned CSS yet. They're not sure what it does. This way, you can just have your page properties formatted with regular XHTML tags. So let me go ahead and click on OK. So now when I look at my page properties, notice I have fewer categories to choose from here, and the actual dialog box itself looks a little bit different. So this is the dialog box I'm going to see when I'm going to be formatting my page with regular XHTML tags. So in this movie, I'm just going to concern myself with the appearance category. So by default, your page is going to have a blank white background. That's always going to be the default color for your pages. If you want to choose a different color or even put an image in the background, you would come in here to do that. So under the appearance section here, actually let me zoom out a little bit so we can see this whole page a little bit better. All right, let me go back to page properties. Now under appearance, the first field we have is background image. And a background image is simply an image that appears behind everything else on your page, making it a background image. What background images do is that they appear behind all the content on your page and they repeat themselves left to right, top to bottom. This is also called tiling. And they fill out the entire page. So even if your image is too small to fill out the entire page, it'll just repeat itself left to right, top to bottom. So for instance, if I browse out into my images folder, and I'm just going to find a small image to use here as an example. Let's just grab the About Us image. So it's just a single button, same one that we see down here. If I click on OK and I hit Apply, you can see the effect there. It's the single button repeating itself left to right, top to bottom to fill out the entire background of the page. Not the prettiest thing to look at right there, but normally when you choose a background image, you should pick an image that has been designed to appear on the background. But if you just spend any time whatsoever on the web, you see stuff like this all the time. Maybe not, text back there, but really busy patterns going on in the background that can just drive you nuts. So let me get rid of that for the moment. Apply that. What I'm going to do instead is apply a background color. Clicking this color well here allows you to choose from a color picker. And as I roll my mouse over here, you can see it's turned into an eyedropper, and I can choose colors for my background just by clicking on a color that I might want to use. Now, to the right of this color picker, there's a little arrow that lets me pick from different color palettes. You can see it just organizes the colors in different ways and gives you different colors. I prefer the organization of the color cubes, but you can look through these different palettes and decide which one you like best. I will point out that color cubes and continuous tone are the browser safe palettes, and this is really not that much of an issue at all anymore. In the early days of the web, you had to worry about something called web safe colors because everybody had video cards that could only display, only a certain range of colors, maybe 250 some colors. So if you chose colors that were out of the range of that card, your page looked pretty bad on those computers. But these days, you're hard-pressed to find a computer that has a card that can't display even millions of colors. So really, the color-safe palette is sort of out the window. You don't need to worry about that anymore. So these days, you can pick just about any color that you like. Another way to pick colors from this palette is to click the System Color Picker. That actually opens up, in this case, the Windows Color Picker. If you're on a Mac, you'll see the Mac Color Picker, which actually gives you a lot more different ways of picking colors. But if I wanted to pick a color from here, I could do so. Click on OK, and I can see it listed in there. Another way to use a color well is if you have a color on your page that you'd like to use as your background color. For instance, let me scroll down a bit. Let me cancel that for a moment. Scroll down. Maybe I want to use this darker color in here. What I can do is click my color well, and with the eyedropper tool, I'm not even going to click in the color picker here. I'm going to come down here, and you notice in the color picker, as I move my mouse around, the color starts appearing in that preview field in the upper left-hand corner. So I can click to select the color, apply, and there it is. So it's that easy. You can just click anywhere on your screen, select the color, and apply it. So I kind of like that color, so I'm going to leave that. And there it is. Now also while you're in here, you notice we have color pickers next to text, links, visited links, and active links. These are the color wells, so you can choose colors if you want your text, for instance, to be something other than the default black. I can come in here and maybe I want it to be a dark green color. I can, again, sample the color here if I like so. Apply that, and there it is, color's changed. You can also set the color for links, visited links, and active links. We're not going to get into that quite yet, but this is where you would set them. By default, most links are usually going to be blue. Once you've clicked on them and returned to them, those links have turned purple. Those are your visited links. And then when you're actually in the act of clicking them, they usually flash a second color, which is commonly red by default, and that's your active link color. But we'll get into that when we actually get into the chapter on linking. But for now, that's what I wanted to show you about page properties, so I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. And I can see the effects of my changes right there. So now I've set a background color, and I've set a default color for my text. So from this point on, any more text that I add is going to be in that color, unless I decide to change that color specifically, which I'll be talking about later as well. One of the big challenges that comes up after your site has been completed and sent up to the web is letting the various search engines out there know that your site even exists. Now, there are two steps to getting your site listed. The first step is to actually go to the search engine's website itself and register it there. The second step, which a lot of people tend to sort of gloss over or not perform at all, is to insert what are called meta tags into your HTML code so that the search engines can find you on their own, and when they do, they can correctly index your site. A lot of search engines out there send programs called robots, sometimes called spiders, out to search the web for content. They just follow link after link after link. When you insert certain meta tags into your document, you make it much easier for these search engine robots to understand how to categorize your site and what your site contains. So let's take a look in this movie at how we add this information. So we're going to be adding what are called meta tags. Meta tags are lines of information that appear only in your HTML code. They don't appear anywhere on the actual document body itself. So people viewing your page will not see these tags. They're there purely for these internet search engines that come out. So to do this, I'm going to go to my insert bar and switch over to the HTML category. And here I'll see various buttons here for working with HTML. And I'm going to be concerned with the head button here. Notice when I click on that, I have meta here for a generic meta tag, keywords, descriptions, refresh, base, and link. I'm going to choose keywords. That's going to open up this keywords dialog box here. And in the keywords field here, you can enter keywords for this particular page. Keywords are essentially there to reflect the content of the page that you're on. Try to put yourself in the shoes of the person who's searching for your site. What type of words might they be typing into Google or Yahoo to try to find sites similar to yours? So in here I might type T, first of all, since I'm working with T-Cloud. Maybe T stores. And notice that I'm separating each of these with a comma and a space. That's how we indicate that these are separate words and phrases. Maybe brewing, green tea, Assam, oolong, jasmine, different types of tea, and so on and so on. Now, you don't want to go too overboard here because certain search engines, in fact, a lot of search engines, limit the number of keywords you can use. So you want to choose your words carefully, and you don't want to use more than, say, 10 or 15 different words or phrases, but you still want to pick the ones that best describe your site's contents. If you use more than that, sometimes the search engines are programmed to just pass you over. So you have to be careful about that. So I'm just going to leave it like that. Click on OK. Now, another type of meta tag that you might want to add is a site description. And you can find that right here again. The description tag is used by many search engines to describe the contents of a particular page in the search engine's listings. So if tcloud.com came up on a search engine, it might actually list the description that's here. If you don't put a description meta tag in here, what the search engines will commonly do is they'll take the first couple lines of text off the body of the page itself, which might not be the best thing to have listed depending on what the text on your page says. So if you have the opportunity, you might as well take advantage of it and type a good description of your site so that for those search engines who do use the description tag, you'll have a nice description for your page. And again, here, you don't want to go too overboard, so you just want to keep it short and sweet to a couple sentences. So for a site like this, I might just type an independent dealer of fine teas and related items. Just something like that. And I'll click on OK. So you see there's been no change to anything here on my page. If I look at the code, here's where you're going to see the meta tags. Here's the meta name, keywords, and then the description is towards the right side. I'm going to turn on word wrap so you can see the whole thing there. So here's meta name, keywords, content, T stores, so on and so on, and then meta name, description, and there's the description that I typed right there. So this is really an aspect of building your web page that has nothing to do with the appearance that most people are going to see, but it's an important behind-the-scenes activity to take care of. And if you're going to add these meta tags to your site, you should generally put it on your front page, the main page of your site. If you want to be really systematic about it, you could just start at the top of your site list, open all of your pages, and add a series of keywords to each one of those pages, which not too many people do, but if you wanted to, you could do that. But at the very least, you want to have your keywords and descriptions on the front page of your site.